Okay. All right. Well, hello to everyone. Obviously, good evening to those joining in the United States and good morning to those joining from Japan, including our speakers. First, we want to express our support for those affected by recent flooding in Kyushu. And of course, we wish everyone safety and health during this uncertain time. In our current global situation, it is essential that we continue to communicate across borders and cultures, as well as within our own communities. Our program this evening, or this morning for some of you, is part of achieving this goal. My name is Paul Pass, and I'm the Executive Director of the Japan-America Society of Dallas-Fort Worth. Before we get into the program, I wanted to go over some suggestions to maximize your experience. If there are any technical issues, such as you are unable to hear the presenters or myself, then please use the chat function. If you have questions during the event, please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. We also encourage you to ask early for your questions, since we may not be able to address all of them during the event. Depending on time, we may be able to integrate some of the questions into our moderated discussion. Please note that this webinar is on the record and it will be recorded. We also plan to upload the program, hopefully by tomorrow, to our JASDFW website and our YouTube channel. If you wish to give in order to support the legacy of the Japan-America Society of Dallas-Fort Worth, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary in 2020, and support its promising future, we kindly ask that you consider a donation to help us continue our great work in the community. Later in this program, we will share a link in the chat box for our online giving portal. I will serve as the program moderator. And before we start with questions for our panelists, I would like to share a little bit about their backgrounds. First, Dylan Scudder is President and CEO of Milestone International Incorporated, a stakeholder management consultancy specialized in organizational development. A Japan resident for 20 years, he earned his PhD from the University of Tokyo with a focus on strategic leadership, CSR, also known as corporate social responsibility, and crisis management. Our other panelist, David Wagner, is president of David Wagner and Company, a crisis management firm specializing in communication strategies and media management. A resident of Japan for over 30 years, he has worked with 530 plus global firms in Asia, North America, Europe, and the Middle East. David is also a member of the Japan-America Society of Colorado. Okay. So now we're ready to begin the program. And before we begin with some more, I guess, hard-pressing questions, we just wanted to check in with Dylan and David. I guess, first of all, David, how are you doing? How is your family, your colleagues? How are you addressing the situation of COVID-19?
Yeah, so, you know, I'm based half in Denver and half in Tokyo, and I've been here in Tokyo for 5 months, headed to Denver next week, actually. So everything's fine. It's been an interesting experience to be in another crisis in Japan. I was also here during Fukushima, and I find that Japan's done a pretty good job of managing this crisis so far, certainly compared to the United States. So everything's good. Everything's going smoothly.
Okay, great. And Dylan, would you also be able to share how you're doing, how your family, your colleagues are doing?
Yeah, thanks. I think similar to David, you know, I've also been here through the last couple of crises, including the Great East Japan earthquake. And also similar to David, I think we've gotten through this one quite well. You know, if there has to be a pandemic, I think Japan is a very good place to be.
That's great. That's great. Okay. So first of all, let's start with David, our first question of the program. So David, COVID-19 has affected travel both to and from Japan. We also know this well at North Texas, given that newly minted flights to Haneda in Tokyo were suspended. What has been your impression of travel thus far? And do we see any distinctions between business travel and travel for leisure?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, this is perhaps the single biggest topic here in Tokyo and Japan as a whole, as the no entry ban remains in place for Americans coming to Japan. And it's a complicated topic. I mean, Japan currently has a no-fly ban on 129 countries, including the United States. And if you leave Japan after July 1st, which I'm planning to do, there's almost no exceptions for re-entry. It's very difficult to come back. Japanese are currently allowed to fly freely to the US, but reciprocally, Americans are not permitted to enter Japan. And it's been that way since April 3rd. Japan is actually the only G7 country that has a re-entry policy that doesn't differentiate between foreign residents and visitors concerning COVID-19 border control measures. You know, we know the obvious reasons for this, the top of which is that the US is a hotspot for COVID cases, and Japan is not, and they like to keep it that way. But beneath the surface is a lot of anger among American business people, and I've experienced it. I've been talking to people here. You know, people are asking, why can't long-term visa holders and permanent residents of Japan enter if they test negative on a PCR test? And Japanese can be carriers of the virus just like Americans, so what's the difference? And so this is the common question. And this is a very good question. And last month, the head of the European Chamber of Commerce stopped short of calling it discrimination in a Foreign Correspondents Club event. I'm not sure I'm going to call it discrimination, but you know, many people feel it is. And the chamber spokesperson last month noted that some businesses are even considering leaving Japan to operate in more reliable places in Asia. So it's hit the boiling point, and you know, traditionally outside pressure works to push reforms through here, but not sure it will succeed this time. But I suspect Japan is using this time to get organized for mass testing of foreigners and travelers, and Japanese as a whole. Currently, business travelers get priority in nations, for example, from Thailand and Vietnam. 250 people a day are permitted to enter from those nations, and that's been proposed. I don't think it's been put through yet. But there's a lot of hoops you have to go through to get back here. You have to have a negative PCR result before you get on the plane. You have to have another PCR test when you land in Japan. Then you need to submit an itinerary of where you're going to be staying. And you have to talk about how you're going to get from the airport to your place in private transportation, because you're not allowed to take trains and taxis. And then you're asked to keep a GPS data on your smartphone so you know they can conduct contact tracing if they need to. So it's a complicated process.
Thanks, Dave. So just curious before we move along, have you been affected by this personally?
Well, I decided to stay here 5 months this time instead of, you know, my standard 2 months here, 2 months there, because I had a lot of work. And so I have been affected by it personally. And I've been gone from Denver for 5 months right now. So yes, it has. And a lot of that time was in, quarantine just like everybody else.
Great. Thank you, David. So now moving on to Dylan. We know that this is an evolving situation around the world. We've seen things change even rapidly in the United States in the last week, really. What are the main issues that Japan is currently focusing on?
Yeah, good question, Paul. You know, like most of us, I think everyone here really is just sort of watching and learning as best they can. There's so much to process, and it's just been nonstop since this thing got started. I think a lot of the issues in business are, of course, industry specific. So you've got those industries that are faring better than others. Let's say the usual lineup is seeing a massive decline in sales, looking at travel, say hotels, restaurants, anything connected to that. At the same time, you've got, say, pharmaceuticals or those in retail that are clearly benefiting. But yeah, on the whole, demand is definitely down. This also depends, I think, a bit on organizational culture. And I think that links also to the size of companies. So if you look at the bigger Japanese companies, they're looking over at METI for direction. So that's the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry here. So a lot of, looking up, as they say here, looking up for directions from above. Then psychology, I think, plays another important role here. So optimistic outlooks will produce very different issues to focus on and to consider than, pessimistic outlooks would. Some still think we might actually be able to bring the virus under control between now and the Olympics. So others are looking at that saying it's much more likely we'll simply learn to live with recurring waves and corresponding levels of the social distancing that happens in lockstep with those waves. So in that sense, I think a lot of people have just gotten over the idea of recovery. They've recognized that after recovery, there's just another stage that will follow that, basically getting ready for the next outbreak. And I think the nature of the challenge here is really more what people call, the VUCA. environment, VUCA for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. That's just become the new normal, as they say. Now, getting back to the question of specific issues, I think as in every other country, there's been sort of a two-track response here right from the beginning. So one of those is focused on health and the other on the economy. And we've all heard this, I think, over and over again ever since this thing got started. Now, in the early stages of the outbreak here, say back in January, February, the response on both of those tracks was mostly monitoring and evaluating the situation. So just trying to learn what you can on the fly. And then on the health side, what that meant was that there was very limited testing, and there was partly, as a result of that, there were very, conspicuously low numbers of reported cases. And then consistent with this, on the economy side, there was hesitation to lock down. And then there was a sort of turning point around, say, early April, just around the time of what we call here Hanami, the cherry blossom viewing. And that's where there were genuinely mixed feelings at that time about whether it was safe to join in those massive all-day picnics in large crowds. It seems sort of funny looking back, but I think that was the emotional turning point for most people. Since then, I think that's where I'll wind down on this one, is we've seen relatively low levels of people infected, but there has been a steady series of what you might call sort of small peaks over the past weeks. A modest increase in testing also, and then ongoing suggestions by the government to, wear masks, wash your hands, social distance, the usual. At the same time, I think we all went through a sort of soft lockdown here for several weeks with, very limited enforcement. And all in all, the overall bandwidth of measures here taken so far has been consistent with that. Basically very moderate, without the highs and lows that we see in other countries, especially compared with many states there in the US.
Thank you so much, Dylan. And just very quickly, one of our attendees was curious. Could you say VUCA again, and it's the acronym and what it stands for?
Yeah, unfortunately, this acronym is going to be with us for a while. It's been around for a few decades too, called VUCA, V-U-C-A. A quick Google will show you. It basically means mayhem.
Interesting. Great. And certainly we know the Japanese people are very resilient. So that's something hopefully we can talk about a little later in the program. But now moving back to David. So the world is also watching Japan closely, given the rescheduled Summer Olympic Games for next year. What do you expect in terms of travel for summer 2021? And on a related note, if we were sitting here 6 months ago, just 6 months ago, we would likely be having quite a different conversation. Given that timeline and the changing nature of this pandemic, how can we develop strategies and policies looking forward already to next summer?
Well, that's a great question. And obviously the Olympics is the hot topic now for July 2021. That's the target. And if they don't relax travel restrictions by the spring of 2021, I can't see how athletes, let alone spectators, would be allowed in or even want to come here. So, this is a big question. And will travel be back to normal because a vaccine for COVID-19 is found and widely distributed? I have my doubts. It's possible, but when you think about having to make 7 billion doses of a vaccine and get it distributed, I mean, it's a multi-year process if you get it developed in the first place. So, even if it is, will people feel comfortable coming here, including the athletes? And all it's going to take really is a number of key teams to say, we're not going to Tokyo, and the whole thing could fall apart. So I don't know what to say. I don't want to be, negative. I want to be optimistic, but we have to be realistic here. There's talk of having the Olympics here with no spectators or Japanese only spectators. I mean, some people are starting to talk about that. But its key is the athletes. And if they're not comfortable, they're not going to come. 6 months ago, the topic was still July 2020. And that would have been a very different discussion. It's been an interesting 6 months. It's been dramatic change.
Great, thank you, David. And I mean, certainly we're getting to that discussion of the Olympics. And obviously we have even sporting events taking place here in the United States and Japan right now that can give us some good information about what to do for 2021. So moving back to Dylan. Dylan, could you share some insights into how decisions are being made about how best to respond at this stage?
Yeah, I think that's been an ongoing question and one that remains top of the list. So I see here a consistent effort to pursue what I would call a strategy of averaging. So what I mean by this, This basically means constantly looking at the response strategies in Europe and the US, sort of looking out at where's the middle, trying to identify where the middle is, and then balancing that with the likely response capacity here. So trying to find, what's working out there, and then to what extent might that work here domestically. So in this sense, Japan's crisis response so far has been characterized by two things. First, averaging, and then exercising leniency. So leniency is on the implementation side. Averaging is more or less about identifying the top performers according to criteria that aren't always so explicit, and then making a decision that represents the average of those decisions of all those top performers. And then the leniency basically means following this and then seeing, to what extent can the public actually go along with that, and leaving it to the public to then decide to what extent they'll follow whatever the guideline is. In other words, there's no reward or punishment for following or not following whatever the government might recommend. So the I think specific question you're asking there is, really about how decisions are being made. And I don't think there's really any way around, say, just the basics of collecting and analyzing data, just as you would in any other country. You have to develop those options for action. And then those options for action are then based on the models that follow this kind of analysis. But culture and risk behavior would definitely play a role here. So I think they play a role specifically in determining, which options are chosen, and maybe also publicly how those options are then justified. So people here might be persuaded by different kinds of arguments, like say collective well-being long-term versus say personal freedom in the short term. A general tendency we do see here also in decision-making is a need for nuance. So I think you see here more of an aversion to those, A or B kinds of binary thinking. It's usually considered wise here to collect and analyze more data before jumping prematurely to a conclusion. And while this can be more a sensible kind of approach, I think it also comes with its own opportunity cost of missing out on all those benefits of quicker decisions that as other countries are able to make perhaps. But this is a well-known trade-off, and we're not going to get away from that anytime soon. Finally, I just say, if the situation we find ourselves in now is getting from whatever stage of infection we're at to say 70% of the population getting infected, we need to do that at a pace where, the healthcare systems can keep up with it. And then we've got to, to be able to do that, we're going to have to, amp up the healthcare capacity as fast as possible. And I think to do that, we're going to need to prioritize people with higher levels of risk. And you can't really do any of that, as you know, without any of the mass testing. So, and that has to be also reliable testing, which opens up a lot of other questions. So currently, I think there are only very limited levels of access to this quality of testing. And we're still left with the question that even if you did take the test, what would you do with the information?
Yeah, and I'd like to add a comment here to what Dylan said. I'm in agreement with him. In terms of how decisions are being made, I'm not actually really clear. We know that policy is often created by unelected bureaucrats and enacted by politicians here. And that's the way it's traditionally been in making decisions, in the post-war period. But these days, I'm not sure. And Tokyo Governor Koike, who was just reelected, has really shined with her open communication style and her daily press briefings. And some of them, I think on Fridays, are in English. So she's done really well. Prime Minister Abe's strategy has been more reserved. But I think, what's clear is Japan has watched closely how the pandemic has played out overseas and is learning from others' mistakes. So the conservative nature of Japan's no-entry policy pits safety over the economy, and there are plenty of holes in that Swiss cheese, that's for sure.
That's great. Thank you, both gentlemen, for sharing. It does really show what Japanese decision-making looks like, both at the federal and either the regional or prefecture levels. Okay, great. So I guess, David, to come back to you, Japan's COVID-19 death numbers and even its positive cases have been especially low. Is this data believable? And what are some theories on why Japan has had these low totals?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, I think Japan's low COVID numbers are more due to Japanese themselves simply staying at home, washing their hands, bowing instead of shaking hands, wearing masks. That more than any specific government policy, the Japanese have done it themselves, and they've really saved Japan. So, why are the numbers low? Lots of theories about that. My take is in part because not every single death in nursing homes or hospice centers or deaths at home are tested for COVID-19. So it's really hard to know for sure, why aren't they being tested? Is there a lack of test kits, or is it a strategy simply to, reduce the number, to reduce the overall burden on the medical system, as Dylan said? I think that's probably it for sure. Could they simply ramp up the testing efforts if they wanted to? Yeah. Why don't they? Hard to know. Really hard to know.
Sorry, before we move along, just curious, David and Dylan, what has been your personal experience in terms of seeing mask wearing in Tokyo?
Yeah, I'll just pick that up. So high 90s, and if you don't wear it, you get the evil eye from some people, particularly on trains. Most people are wearing masks properly, which means they're covering their nose and their mouth. You see an occasional person not doing so. To be honest, if I see people not wearing masks, more often than not, it's non-Japanese. And I think outside, people are more comfortable not wearing masks, just like they are in the States. But inside, almost everyone's doing it. And I think women are doing it more than men. That's what I notice.
Yeah, I think my observations are consistent with David's there. I might just add that you also notice that anxiety levels sort of fluctuate in lockstep with the information that becomes available in the media. So, as we hear, for example, that being outdoors sort of reduces the risk of contagion, you feel a little bit less anxious about the occasional jogger, running past without a mask. Whereas in the early days, that was reason for panic already.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so Dylan, coming back to you, do you anticipate any changes in the way Japan will handle the challenges ahead?
Yeah, I think until now, the challenges here in Japan have been handled along the lines of a standard risk management process. So there you've got across, as you would in any other country, basically 5 stages. So you focus in first on just identifying the risks. What is it we're looking at here? Just setting up some categories of risks that you're looking at. And then analyzing and assessing those risks, essentially looking at the levels of severity. So you've got your categories, and then you look at, how high or how low are we on each of those categories. Then creating and implementing a risk management plan. So once you've sort of understood the lay of the land, you kind of lay out your strategies for what you're going to do at individual levels of risk. And then monitoring, so looking around to see what your results are, and then measuring more specifically what those results are and adjusting accordingly. So that's a sort of a standard, more sophisticated version of trial and error, really. Now, I haven't seen anything to suggest that there'd be any big changes in this approach going forward. But I think looking at the many isolated decisions in response that we've seen so far here, you could say that it is reasonable to assume that we'll continue to see some form of shuttling between, on the one hand, you've got the big ongoing data collection and analysis that, we hear sort of daily updates or weekly updates more these days. So on the complex issues. And then forms of burden sharing more on the other end, where you look to a slow return to normal work life. Now, looking at that sort of area of work life, you might see some changes, but I'm a little more, let's say, pessimistic there. I think you've got more likely the idea that we're going to make up for lost time, and we're going to see a more conservative approach than even before the crisis. So we've got to kind of double down. And that's, I think, a likely scenario we could expect. Then I think it also depends, again, on the industry. So in my case, I work with mostly companies and universities. So, of course, they all just want to shorten the distance between where we are now, get out of this and get back to something that we recognize as normal. I think for companies, that means getting started on their plans to regroup, rebuild, recover, all of that. And then for universities, I think same as there in the US, maybe even more so, we've all gone completely online. So all of my courses are online now too, as any of my colleagues. And then a challenge at universities is a special one of replicating that century-long experience that they had over the past hundreds of years in some cases. And then at the individual level, to bring in individuals, as you might expect, you see here a lot of people in Japan also asking for more career advice. So thinking about career transitions, career planning. This has been a major stress test for our survival strategies here. And a lot of people are, I think, pivoting to something that's going to include an online element. So I think a lot of people here have noticed that, being confined to your home, you've really got to have at least some of your work, or if you can, even all of your work deliverable online. So if nothing else, you've got to be able to, come to work and have that online as a fallback option. Unfortunately, this isn't realistic for a lot of people, but I think this is an exciting space that we ought to stay focused on and see what happens in the coming weeks and months.
That's great to share. And obviously, things are really changing rapidly. Or if we had this conversation even maybe a month or two ago, it could have been quite different. So that's great. So moving along now to, so obviously we've been talking a lot about domestic Japanese challenges. Now coming to David, how do potential changes in strategy and policy affect business between the United States and Japan? And how do we also understand the low jobless rate in Japan, whereas unemployment figures in the United States have been quite high during COVID-19?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. The numbers are low, but they're not without impact here. I think in April, the overall number of non-regular employees decreased by 970,000 from a year earlier. And of that, 710,000 were women. So the numbers are coming down, and there's more to come, I suspect. So that accordingly affects business and feeds through the economy. And that means there'll be more government stimulus to come, just like in the United States. But certain sectors like AI and IT are actually benefiting from work at home efforts. For example, manufacturing is down. I'm not hearing of mass layoffs like in the US, but I suspect that there will be. And if nothing else, there'll be cuts in pay to come. That's happening a lot here. And I think poverty levels are rising. I've been reading a lot about that. And more employees are deciding to stay at home longer than they would normally. And the whole issue of how is stay at home and how does work at home affect overall performance is just like the United States being analyzed. So like everywhere else in the world, the carnage is increasing, and I'm seeing more shops are closed and boarded up, particularly in the area where I'm at in Hito and Roppongi. The Japanese propensity to save is probably going to ease the blow here, and I think a lot of young contract workers are experiencing the deepest impact because they don't have a lot of savings. But I think there's going to be more stimulus, and it's got to happen. There's a couple of $1 trillion already that Japan's put forth, and that's trickling itself through the economy.
That's great. That's great. So, and hopefully we can talk a little more about U.S.-Japan relations as we get into towards the end of the program. So moving back now to Dylan. So we just talked about companies from David's perspective. What advice can you share for companies as we emerge from the pandemic and take our next steps?
Yeah, really important question again, Paul. So, my experience, especially working with the companies here in Japan, is that, teams tend to discover, or in many cases, rediscover their collective strengths by running these disaster scenarios. So just going through those on a regular basis, that's something that's more essential now for businesses than ever before. I think just building that into a form of hygiene, really, just having that as part of normal business. Those exercises can, cover a range of crisis situations, as I mentioned before. In the old days, people talked about pest analysis or, STEP analysis, and that acronym just gets longer and longer as the decades roll on. So we're up to something now that breaks down to an acronym called STEEPLED, where you build in, ethical, demographic, all the other risk categories on top of, say, social and technological and the usual ones. I think each organization will also have its own metrics, so it does need to be specific at that level. But there are also some universal models. You could look at McKinsey. They have this 5-part analysis they call the 5 horizons. So that's resolve, resilience, return, reimagination, and reform. And then I think in essence, what we're really looking at here, if you think about those 5 stages, you're talking about stages of restabilizing. So these are, stages that organizations can use to assess their readiness for, say, near future scenarios. Really getting through the recovery stage and then preparing to move forward with a more robust and what people are calling, future-proof business model. I think one lesson we've also learned here in Japan, or maybe again one that's been reconfirmed, is that plans and manuals can also be a little risky because they give organizations a sense of a false sense of security. And there's this idea that, well, we have a plan, so we're okay. But I think, as the wartime expression warns us, no plan survives contact with the enemy. Now, the minute you try to move away from understanding to actually implementing a plan, that's when you notice that. You inevitably discover pitfalls that you just weren't aware of before, things that really only show up after you've tried to kind of stress test your plan. So, meanwhile, I think you've also got this ongoing just flood of information to keep up with. A lot of times in management, the problem is discussed as imperfect information, as in not enough information. And I think we're suffering just the opposite of that now. We're just saturated with too much information to process, and a lot of contradicting information too. So how do you navigate through that? I think, at the same time, a lot of companies have just been sort of on the back foot ever since this COVID-19 thing, broke onto the scene, and now still find themselves in these unprecedented circumstances and trying to find their balance. I think, in the end, you've got teams that just need to sort of set aside some time for reorientation, regroup, recenter, and just rediscover their balance. I think you can often, do this with simple models. There are things that we knew before the crisis that are still valid today. If you think about very basic things like the gap analysis, so just taking some time as a group to sort of articulate where you want to be in, say, July of 2021, and then comparing that to the current situation, and then doing some backward planning to agree on a strategy for getting there. So in the end, I think, just like any other skill, a company that has this kind of experience will naturally respond more effectively than a company that doesn't.
I'd like to add a comment here because, Dylan's touched on crisis management, which is also what I do, and manuals, which are more or less limited in their usefulness during a crisis. I think we're seeing also some cultural change here in Japan. So I'm quite fascinated to watch how work from home is forcing companies to look at if this can become a long-term change. And some companies really wanted to save on, leasing costs, for example. But there's the dynamic of the employees saying, you know what, I like working from home. I don't want to get on a crowded train anymore. I'm going to change my life. And if you don't offer this to me as an option, I'm going to dust off the resume and go to a company that's going to offer it to me. So companies are being forced, even in a labor shortage in Japan, to look at these new dynamics and adapt.
Mm-hmm. That's extremely valuable. Gentlemen, I was just curious, how do you see, I guess, David, you talked a little bit about this. How do you see some of this crisis management and this forecasting, this planning, how is it unique in the Japanese environment in comparison with maybe the United States?
So crisis is a universal event, and the way in which an organization responds to it is there's some do's and don'ts no matter where you are in the world, no matter what your culture is. And I'm talking about from the media side, which is my specialty, right? You've got to have spokespersons that are ready to go. You've got to have the right messaging. You've got to have believable comments. And so from that perspective, it's not really any different. What I found in Japan through the Fukushima crisis, I was working in the Prime Minister's office at the time with the communications team, is that Japanese don't really move quickly in a crisis because they don't move quickly in general anyway. They need to dot their I's and cross their T's and form a group consensus. And the problem in a crisis, especially a Fukushima type crisis, is that you don't have a lot of time. This is a different kind of crisis. COVID-19 is a slow moving train wreck. It's not a fast moving train wreck. So you do have time to learn from others and to make systemic decisions. But I wouldn't say Japan's any different from anywhere else, really, other than that.
Yeah, I just concur there. And I think you've got a bit of a tendency, if you compare the US and Japan, I think some of the stereotypes actually still stick. So the urge to take action versus the sense of kind of stepping back and understanding the broader situation before taking action, I think is still valid. So, on a kind of systematic approach here, you often notice there's first a tendency to, map out the extremes and understand, what would be the extreme solutions that usually come with some pretty heavy costs. And those can be extreme on the active side, extreme on the passive side, for example. And then you try to kind of map out more moderate solutions in the middle. And that's where you, I think, end up in the end with a lot of the decision making here.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you so much for those comments. So David, I'm going to ask you a question here. It actually relates to another Q&A question we already received from an attendee. So David, what are your concluding thoughts on the effects of tourism, both Japanese coming to the US and Americans visiting Japan?
Yeah, so tourism's been wiped out here. The target was supposed to be for the Olympics in July 2020 as planned to have 40 million tourists here this year. They were on track to do that in January and early February. They had, I think, 5 million entries in that period, and they would have hit it. But of course, it's been devastated. I think it's been down 99%, as I think the statistics were last month. So every sector is being affected here, and this is forcing many in the tourism industry to appeal to domestic travelers with staycation ideas and people to work from home who want to just get out for the weekend. So, oddly, countryside rentals are booming. I know people that own homes in the country that are renting it out. They're making a lot of money, and it's giving an unprecedented boost to the rural areas, which desperately need it, especially places like Kyushu now with the heavy rain. So it's a 1-2 punch for the economy. Travel and leisure is really being hit hard, just like in the United States. But let's see where this goes. I think they're trying to ease up a little bit, but they're asking people not to travel to other regions right now because even the numbers in Tokyo are still starting to rise back to the May numbers. So we've had, I think, 5-6 days consecutively with over 100 people testing positive in Tokyo. That doesn't sound like much in Texas. And it's not, but I'll tell you what, it's a big deal here where they're doing less than 10,000 tests a day.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you so much, David. And I can share also from the Japan American Society of Dallas-Fort Worth, every spring we send 2 runners as well as a chaperone to Sendai, the Sendai International Half Marathon. And it's been just a tremendous way to connect with Sendai, which is a friendship city with Dallas. And unfortunately, that event was canceled and we were not able to naturally send those runners. So that was just one small area in which we could not connect. Okay, so coming back to our discussion about the relationship between the United States and Japan, this question is for Dylan. The US and Japan have taken different approaches thus far to address COVID-19. What are your final thoughts on specific lessons that the 2 countries might be able to learn from each other?
Yeah, another really important question, Paul. Thanks for that. I think if business is about making good decisions with imperfect information, limited resources, and, the demanding time constraints, then this crisis has been the ultimate training course, maybe one that we would like to wrap up right now. So that said, I think benefiting from the many lessons that we've learned will require some detailed analysis first. So from that perspective, it's probably still a little early to say what we could actually learn from each other before we can say with confidence, what we've learned domestically. So, all the lessons that we've actually learned in our respective contexts are going to be different, but we're going to see a lot of overlap there. I think we'll have to wait and see, for example, also how the stats pan out. So looking at alcohol consumption, domestic violence, suicide, and just overall damage to people's physical and psychological health. I think a lot of people, and David touched on this earlier, a lot of people just aren't going to be ready to go back to work, even when the doors open up again and it's time to sort of get back to what we used to think of as normal. A lot of people are kind of in a different mode right now. And I think this is all going to also depend greatly on who you ask. So, especially thinking about people's social status, the nature of people's work and their overall ability to sustain themselves is going to be very different. I think at the company level too, we're going to see different, say company sizes. So you've got the small businesses that might not actually be able to, quote unquote, return because there's just nothing to return to. And for a lot of them, this social distancing thing has been, going on for so long that it's basically stopped their flow of oxygen for longer than they could hold out. I think, a meaningful comparison can be made, but it's going to require agreeing some of those specific goals and, looking at some performance metrics. We can get that nailed down, and I think we can identify a range of issues and then ask ourselves, how effective were the approaches on those specific issues in the different countries. say in the US and Japan. A concrete example though might be the tourism industry. So, you could zoom in on one and then start to chisel that down. So you might look at, what's actually happened there, as David mentioned, just completely destroyed. I think the Japan Tourism Agency was saying that far over 90% had been, just wiped out compared to the same period last year. So, in a nutshell, I think we could probably extract, say, 3 lessons from this one. First of all, there's a balance that we need to get there between the needs of business on one side and then the needs of employees' well-being on the other. A second lesson would be the need to maximize the amount of remote work that we can do, so working online. And then finally, keeping a focus on people's health in the workplace. It's not going to be sufficient to just talk in general terms anymore. You've really got to, get into some details there, thinking about, well, what does hygiene actually mean? PPE kits, the personal protective equipment. What is your, sick leave policy? All of that has to be, I think, formulated, articulated in more detail now.
Can I add a comment too? I'm basically in agreement with what Dylan's saying, but on the business side of things, a year ago, Japanese firms collectively were sitting on about $900 billion in cash. And some of this was earmarked for overseas acquisitions. And, I don't think you're going to see many more overseas acquisitions the size of Takeda's purchase of Shire last year for $64 billion. I think these companies want to hold on to their cash until they've got a little bit more runway in front of them. So Japan is faced, like many places in the world again, with the prospect of a lower GDP, which is prolonged and may lead to changes that we don't anticipate in the way Japan has historically in the post-war period operated. So I think we just have to hold tight and see what happens and hope for the best.
Great. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. So I think now we're going to move to audience Q&A. And so if anyone still has questions, please feel free to write them in. We have a few in the queue, so we're going to start with those. So I just wanted to jump because we had a few people comment on education. So what is, I guess it's kind of related. So how are schools being managed? What procedures are being used? And I believe this person is referring to university to elementary. So that's quite broad, obviously. I know we have several people attending this program who are involved in education at multiple levels. So if you could comment on education in Japan right now.
Well, so I'm not familiar with what protocol is being done in schools in terms of safety, so I'm going to defer comment on that. But I do know that online education is booming, just like in the States. It's changing the nature here of the way in which universities operate, what their revenue streams are like. And it's also forcing a systemic change in the way in which teachers teach and students learn. And so I think this is here to stay. It's clearly, from a revenue point of view, you don't need a facility, you don't need property, you don't need to pay all those maintenance fees by doing online training, and that's going to, of course, affect the total amount of money that's charged for these courses. So we're seeing a revolution, I think, in the way in which education occurs everywhere, and including Japan. And I don't think the dust has settled on this yet.
Yeah, I think, I've noticed a lot of that too. So what David says really rings true for me at the university level. You've got a lot of new lessons that have been learned. I think things that we thought were just sort of common sense, you either do something face-to-face or you do it online. It's not that cut and dry, actually. We've got in the Zoom platforms now, of course, everyone has quickly learned how to use those breakout rooms and things like that. But there are more subtle areas. If you ask students, what kind of online sessions do you prefer? They have a choice between those that are pre-recorded and then those that are live. You get a very different kind of let's say polling result there. Some will talk about the advantages of being able to sort of dip in anytime. That allows me to go and do my part-time job. Others will say, no, I really need that live session just to have the motivation to actually get through the coursework. I don't want to just have to download something that I could just as well do for free. Why would I need to pay university tuition for that? So there's a lot going on in this space, and I think you see that here in Japan as you would in other countries.
Mm-hmm. I'm just curious before we move along to the next question, how do you feel that Japan is set up for online education? I know in general, again, there are many alternatives too. But how is Japan set up for online instruction? And Japan can be a very traditional country in that respect. Just curious what you've seen.
I might
Well,
just
so go ahead,
go
Dylan.
ahead. All right. So yeah, we've got a good synergy here. I think you've got, on the positive side, clearly, as you mentioned, traditional, but as everyone knows about Japan, you've always got the extremes of maintaining tradition and pushing forward on high tech, a really powerful combination. And, you've got, in terms of infrastructure, this is a paradise. So we've got a very reliable, kind of environment to work within. Now, again, just sort of going over to the traditional side, maybe within the university environment, you've got the I would say problem for especially the more senior members who are perhaps used to a less interactive style, where you pick up a microphone, talk for 90 minutes, and class is over. And that just won't work. You cannot subject people to a 90-minute session in front of a screen. You've really got to learn how to build in some, activities, exercises, questions, teams, groups, pairs, all of that, just to keep it alive. So I think those would be some of the, say, advantages and disadvantages that we're looking at here in Japan.
Yeah, and I'd add to the comment, I just finished up 18 8-hour days of training for a company in Yokohama. So I know what it's like. If you make it interactive, it's going to go pretty well. There's not a lot of lecture that is effective. But I think when it comes to education here, I'm seeing more progressive change among the foreign universities. And I'm thinking specifically of Temple, because I know people who work there. They're pretty much all online, and they're doing interactive, innovative ways of teaching. I can't say for sure if that's systemically going on among Japanese universities, but I know this place is diverse. We all like to think that Japan is all one thing, one way or the other, but there's tremendous diversity. The people in Shibuya are different than the people in Ginza, and that's the way in which the economy works. There's all kinds of progressive companies out there that get it, and there's lots of companies that don't. So that's my comment on that.
Right. Thank you. And we're going to move to some questions about the Olympics in a moment, but I wanted to cover one question that came in as well. To the best of your knowledge, what is the status of U.S. military and families who are in Japan right now? Are they a little more, they have a little more flexibility in terms of coming and going, or are they still under the same restrictions?
I don't have knowledge about that. I do know someone who's in the State Department who was supposed to go to China but tested positive for COVID-19, and so the U.S. military has taken control of that, not let that person go. So I would suspect it's U.S. military policy that's taking precedence over what's going on those bases. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, let's come back to a discussion on the Olympics, since that's obviously it's in the title of our program this evening too. So there was concern over moving the marathon to Sapporo in advance of 2020. And it is possible that more athletic events with the Olympics may now be decentralized based on COVID concerns. So we have actually Stephen, who is a member and who has spent time in Japan. He's curious, are there more changes, are more changes unlikely? And also, what type of entry requirements may be needed that were not previously in place for the Olympics?
So again, without knowledge, I'm not an IOC member and I'm not privy to, Olympic policy. But I think what's pretty clear is that they're thinking outside the box here to make this thing work. And if that means going to different parts of Japan, then I think that that's probably what they'll do.
Yeah, and I think also all of this is sort of nested within, a broader framework here. We come back to, are we actually going to have an Olympic, games here in Tokyo? So, the optimistic scenario would be that, yeah, sure, we're going to have, reliable testing, any day now, and that's going to, be there for everyone, access for everyone, and at the same time, we'll develop some kind of herd immunity over time. As you can see, it's getting increasingly difficult to stay optimistic given a rather tight timeline, really. So, you've got that on the one end, and then you've got, the more pessimistic side, and basically just looking at the opposite. So, we're going to continue to move in and out of lockdowns over the coming months, and different countries are going through different stages of this meanwhile. And Olympics are, by nature global. How are you possibly going to manage, all of that and people's safety at the same time?
So let me just add another comment, Paul, if I can. I've spent over 30 years here, almost 40 total. And I learned over time that Japan needs time to make decisions. And I would suspect they're using this quote unquote downtime to make some very important decisions about testing, including things like saliva tests, so that they can take mass numbers of people without undue concern about safety. There'll be accurate testing. So if we get accurate testing, we can do mass testing here. You can get those flights coming into Japan in a bigger way. I think it's very possible that we could have the Olympics the way they want. The issue is the comfort level of people coming here, and that's something nobody can control.
That's great. That's great. So let's move on to some other topics, and let's have a few more minutes for questions. So first of all, let's talk about businesses. So for future Japanese company planning, do you think COVID-19 will put forward strategies to avoid future or unwind current investment business with the United States? This person is asking for the next 5 to 7 years. Obviously, that's difficult to see. So I'm just curious on some of your thoughts. We've talked about it a little during the program, but just welcome your thoughts as well.
I might just mention a few of the just a few of the threats on the horizon, as it were. We've got at least I think 3 major ones that are very top of mind for people here. There's the obvious continued spread of the virus. So that could go either way. You could have controlled levels of the spread by, say, the end of the 3rd, 4th quarter, or you could have, regional recurrence, just sort of ongoing. Then you've got the other, I think, threat area of just public health response leading up to the vaccine, assuming that a vaccine actually happens. And within that period, you've got, different degrees of control that can definitely affect the way things go. And then you've got the economic policy response at the same time. You've got an ongoing threat there of, bankruptcies continuing as they are, leading into credit defaults and worse. So all of those are, just as a package, they can easily set in motion other unforeseen threats of unemployment, financial crisis. There's no reason to expect that, we won't be hit by another kind of crisis during all of this. We were reminded that this morning with an earthquake here in Tokyo. I think a lot of business people in the audience will also know that, this is a leadership question. This is all about, defining moments and choosing between, as they say, right and right. So you got a lot of tough decisions going forward. And the crisis we're experiencing now is just going to, I think, go into the foreseeable future as we see it today. So you're going to be faced with some really tough questions, and they won't be the simple intellectual questions of, say, investing in health-related projects versus the company's traditional business. These are going to be increasingly about renegotiating contracts, likely managing also a lot of interpersonal conflict in the workplace and the usual that you see when resources dry up.
And I'd add here, from a crisis management point of view, that there are very few crisis manuals that were written by companies and organizations that had pandemic in it. And one thing that's going to change is pandemic's going to be in it. And I think, life insurance companies, reinsurance companies, they were prepared for this kind of thing. Governments were prepared for it, but most companies were not. And the SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises, will probably continue not to be able to plan much because they just don't have the resources. But I think that's a big change we're going to see, is the ability to foresee a long-term problem. Because most crises, for example, Fukushima, we knew what we had. We had an earthquake and we had a tsunami and we had the aftermath, and it was over, and now you got to clean up. Well, Fukushima, the 6 nuclear reactors are not over, but everything else in terms of damage has been pretty much repaired. I think what this could be, what I refer to again as a slow-moving train wreck that just keeps going and going and going. It could be years and years where we just have to adapt to social distancing and be prepared with equipment and vaccines and treatments to manage this thing. And I think that's where we're going. Yeah, it's a long-term deal.
Great. Thank you again, gentlemen. We're going to try to finish up, hopefully doing 2 last questions here. So first of all, how is, to the best of your knowledge, what does 5G technology look like in Japan? And could this be adapted to address kind of these changing environments and new work styles in Japan?
I don't know much about 5G other than the fact that most people feel they've lost the battle to the Chinese. I know that I've heard talk here of talking about 6G now. So I know Japan's looking forward to the next stage, 10 years or whatever it is down the road. But I would guess, yeah, obviously that technological advantage and that innovation is going to be very useful. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page there.
Great, thank you. So let's end on just one question that kind of wraps up part of the title of our program too. And I understand that you're not IOC specialists, that we can only gather so much information from the Olympics, but have you heard of any ways in which the Olympics might redesign ways in which they're dealing with large groups, with tourists? As an example, or at least I've heard of temperature machines that you might see in airports that will monitor people's temperature as they're entering. And so I'm curious if you've heard about any technology that might be used to address those large crowds for the Olympics.
Go ahead, Dylan.
No, I was just going to say, I think you've touched on one of those points, and then David's also brought in the example of what they're doing with the tests at the airports here. But you can only take that so far. And, we've seen, on another front here with sports, how you've got now games that are happening, without the spectators. So turning it into really a media event, things that you can see from home, but not really in person. So in terms of what you can do with technology, I think that's about as far as we've gotten. But, getting away from the extremes, I think just a general reading of the situation, maybe a more moderate reading of a future scenario might be just to assume that, the prudent way forward here is to invest more in monitoring and evaluating the situation until we know more. You're just not going to be able to come up with any, hard and fast solutions at this point. And, it could be that, we're going to learn more from strategies applied in other countries that might inspire some thinking here for how we could approach it. But at the moment, I think everyone's just still keeping up with the domestic reality.
Yeah, and I would add that I am reading a lot about new innovative technologies to measure temperature and distance and things like that. And could that be applied to the Olympics? Sure. How would you enforce it? That's a different issue. What are you going to do? Pull somebody out of the stands in the middle of a show and say, "Sir, could you come with me?" I think that's the harder issue than analyzing what's going on with people's temperature. When you come into Narita or Haneda, they've already got these temperature measurement machines that tell you if you've got a fever. That's been there for years. It started with SARS and MERS and all those things earlier in the decade or so. So I don't know. I think I'm with Dylan on this one, that I think it's more important to have self-decision making as to what you do in these situations than to rely on any sort of technology to tell you what to do.
That's great. Thank you for sharing, gentlemen. And I can share for those joining from North Texas, we have some tremendous Japanese companies that are working on this. One example is NEC. They're one of our strongest partners, and their North American headquarters are just here in Irving. So wonderful. Well, we're going to go into closing remarks. So thank you, gentlemen, again for your time. Thank you again for your insights on an important time for Japan and for U.S.-Japan relations. We greatly appreciate the time that you've given us today and your willingness to share. We'd also like to express our gratitude to everyone who attended this program, and we apologize if we could not get to all of the questions, but if you have anything specific you would like to know, please send your question to info@jasdfw.org. Again, that's info@jasdfw.org, and we will send these questions to our panelists. We kindly ask that you complete the post-event survey, which will pop up in your internet browser after the program ends. If you are unable to view this or access the survey, we will share it again through an email tomorrow. We also hope that you can join for some upcoming events. Please support our sister Japan-America societies in California and New York for the Japan-US Innovation Symposium and the Japan Cuts Film Festival, both which will be presented starting next week, and the links to those events are on our website. Please save the date for Friday, July 31st, when we present a family-friendly workshop on Hana-iku, representing the beauty of flowers. On August 6th, we are planning another family program on a traditional summer day in Japan. And next month, we are hosting a discussion on the COVID-19 importance of baseball in the US and Japan with former player Matt Merton, who joined us for our Japan Currents program earlier this year, and former manager Bobby Valentine, who many of you may know. And this will be in addition to other speakers. We'll also have an event on Japanese health and wellness with a noted medical professional and a representative from Itoen North America. Once again, please check our website, jasdfw.org, for regular updates as we schedule more programs throughout the summer and into the fall. This concludes tonight's program, or I guess this morning's program for you in Japan. Thank you for attending and have a wonderful rest of your day or morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Dylan.
Thanks, everybody.